responsibility standpoint. So we've got Sean Keatts down on my far right, director with Barclays, Barclays Capital. We've got Hiran Cantu in the center, also director with Barclays, and we have John Miller, director with Citi. So gentlemen, take it away.
Okay, I think we'll just take it from here as we have sort of a unified presentation. So we'll take it from the table here. I guess on behalf of Barclays and Citi, I do want to thank GPA and the CCU for allowing us to come here, participate, and to offer our thoughts on, on the financing side of the LNG projects. I will say as an observation, it's been a very informative discussion, and it's been a good morning and afternoon. Some very smart people have spoken about these projects, a lot of engineers, and so in some sense we're going to just take it down a notch and talk about finance for a little bit and talk about how some of the alternatives, the different risks, the different costs that are involved, and some of the trade-offs, and try to kind of walk through that. But before we get to sort of the financing structures, and there's four main ones that we're going to speak about, we do want to spend a little time just providing a little important background regarding the projects themselves, the financing, the credit ratings of Guam Power, some of the revenue requirements that are involved, all of which play an important factor in terms of the costs and the risks for each of these financing alternatives. So I guess if we could turn to, I guess maybe page 3 in the presentation. The next page, yes. So I mean, this has been described in a variety of ways today, so I'm not going to go through them in each point, but I think from a finance perspective, this is how sort of the investors and rating agencies will look at this project. It certainly, as has been described, offers a variety of benefits, from potentially lower power costs, meeting environmental compliance standards, avoiding paying for other type of environmental spending, updated generation fleet, and greater fuel diversity. On the challenging side, or the concerns, that are largely related to the construction or the building of a large infrastructure project. At the same time, also, the transformation, as we've described here, from an entity that is exclusively residual fuel oil based to something entirely new, and that's just sort of a organizational, a personnel, and sort of a culture change that's involved with that. And then lastly, I think the concerns or challenges will also be on the financial impact in terms of the funding of these LNG projects. As I mentioned, there's a variety of different ones, and it's just a matter of sort of assessing the costs and risks and the trade-offs that are involved. Next slide, please. The graph on this page sort of illustrates the sort of budget capacity that exists for these LNG projects. So on the left side of this chart illustrates Guam Power's, their existing and past and forecasted the amount that they've paid for in terms of fuel oil. And these numbers may change, but this is sort of the line item from their income statement, and it's generally around $300 million. The forecast for 2018 was made back in 2012 in their official statement, but again, it's around $300 million. The bars on the right of this chart illustrate the debt service associated with funding the LNG infrastructure projects, and we'll get into those a little bit more in the presentation. But in a sense, the different structures have different costs, and again, they have different risks and trade-offs, but nonetheless, they show sort of the band by which that they operate under. And in general, they range from around $60 million to maybe a little over $110 million. And so that leaves, $225 million for LNG fuel, LNG O&M, and other associated costs. And that is in respects to the existing budget of fuel costs. So there's the capacity that exists within existing rates. The next slide, please. Just a little bit, just to take a step back regarding the projects. I sort of look at them in terms of three major components. There is the constructing of the LNG import terminal and gasification facilities, and that I'm using estimates that Guam Power provided us, and that's sort of estimated around $212 million. There's also the retrofitting of the existing units, and that can vary depending upon which units are being retired, but the particular scenario that is being operated as the base case has that, I think, on 2 units, and that cost is around $29 million. And then there's the constructing of a new combined cycle unit. and that cost is around $447 million. And that assumes a particular size, and as has been described today, there are a variety of paths that may take. But again, this is one particular scenario. So you're talking about $688 million of capital costs. If you look at the graph, the lower part of that graph, you will see the sort of how those funds are being spent in terms of which year and in sort of what schedule. And I think the big takeaway from that is that a large part of the spending is at the early part of the schedule, and that's really related to the construction of the new combined cycle unit. So again, just something to keep in mind in terms of these are the projects and these are the costs that we are speaking of. The next slide, please. These are the assumptions on the financial analysis that we'll describe in more detail, and I'm not going to go through each one of them. The primary ones I want to pass on to you are that we are talking about financing project costs of nearly $700 million. The financing assumes, and this is just an assumption, that interest is capitalized through the completion date of the particular projects. And that is simply an assumption. It's a decision that GPA, the CCU, the PUC, and the legislature will all sort of work together in terms of coming up what they want to do with costs. But this is just the assumption that ratepayers will not be burdened with the cost of this project until those projects are actually completed. Another key assumption is that the financing is assumed to be all fixed rate. And the rates that we were using were rates as of last week. And obviously, as you know, interest rates will change. And finally, the other assumption that is within the financial analysis is that the $688 million of project costs are split into two financings, one in 2015 and another in 2017. Next slide. Now, to put the debt that we're talking about, and the debt is almost $800 million for all of the costs if it were done directly on GPA's balance sheet. To put that in perspective, we want to just provide some background on the current profile of GPA's debt. As the graphs show on the upper left side, Guam Power has about $530 million of existing debt, and they have another $60 million or so in capital leases. All their debt is in fixed rate mode, and that debt creates essentially debt service of around $60 or so million, dropping to around $40 million for the next several years. At the same time, most of their debt is on a senior lien basis, meaning that its debt service is paid prior to a small amount of subordinate lien that will actually mature in a few years. Another important consideration as we think about the scenarios is Guam Power's ratings. As the chart on the upper left described, Guam Power's senior lien debt is rated Baa3 by Moody's, BBB by Standard & Poor's, and BBB- by Fitch Ratings. Now, over the last several years, the credit profile of GPA has improved quite a bit, and you see that in the chart on the upper right side that shows the rating upgrades over the last several years. Guam Power, along with many of the other Guam credits, have made significant improvements in their credit. At the same time, you also have to keep in mind the chart at the bottom, and in terms of its relative credit standings. And so Guam Power, despite its several upgrades over the last several years, still is at the lower end of the rating spectrum. And from an investor perspective, this is something that they're looking at. It is investment grade, and it has been very well received by the market, but it is something that has to be kept in mind as you assess the risks that you place on the credit profile and to ensure that it stays in a relatively strong position. Next slide. Regarding the credit profile and maintaining the credit position, it's a detail, but it's important, the debt service coverage considerations. So, at a very high level, debt service coverage is a credit metric. In fact, it's one of the most important ones in public power and utilities, and in some sense public finance in general. At the highest level, it essentially shows the annual revenues relative to the amount of debt service that it needs to pay. So for an example, a 1 times coverage means that the net revenues that it has after paying operating and maintenance expenses, it has just enough to cover the debt service. And as you can see on the chart on the upper right, there's 2 different measures, but these are the historical debt service coverage that Guam Power has had over the last several years. Now let me talk a little bit about the differences of those 2 different metrics. When Guam Power finances it has its indenture, which is essentially its promise to its bondholders on certain financial tests that it will meet when it issues its bonds. Guam Power's indenture requires that it set its rate so that it achieves a 1.3 times debt service coverage on its senior lien bonds. Now, it's an important distinction to understand that the debt service comes from what I would describe as direct debt, debt that is actually issued by Guam Power. It does not incorporate costs related to capital leases. It also does not include the fixed capacity cost if it were in an O&M expense. And that's an important distinction to understand. The other important debt service coverage measure or consideration is the PUC target of 1.75. It is similarly calculated using direct debt, and it's at a higher level, and it is there to ensure that debt service is made. It is also there to ensure that sufficient equity is created within the system. But again, we're talking about coverage on direct debt. The last part is described in the chart on the lower right side is the rating agency practice and the trends. And what we've seen over the last 3 to 4 to 5 years is an increasing trend among rating analysts to incorporate fixed capacity costs, to incorporate fixed charges, not just debt service, but a fixed capacity component that may be in a purchase power agreement. And that has meaningful implications in terms of the type of structures that Guam Power might consider. So, for example, if Guam Power creates an SPE that is backed by an unconditional obligation, a take or pay, where it will buy that power, it will make those payments regardless of whether it's delivered, the rating agencies will incorporate that into the debt service coverage. So while that SPE may create the flexibility of not having to raise rates above 1 times, because it's not impacted by the indenture rate covenant or the PUC target. If they were to just raise revenues by the amount of the debt service, that would actually, in effect, dilute its debt service coverage as measured by the rating agencies. And that will create some tension at its existing rating level. And as I mentioned, its credit standing and where it is in the spectrum of public power and other electric utilities similar to itself matter. And so if it allows its debt service coverage to dilute, that creates a consideration. It's a challenge. And I think that one point that I think we'll describe today is that all these are choices. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just a matter of where along the risk spectrum and the cost spectrum that Guam Power wants to find itself in. So that I'll turn to Sean to talk about the scenarios in more detail.
Next page, please. So we're actually going to consider 4 separate financing structures today, and I'm going to go over the first 3, and then I'm going to let, which are sort of three financing structures on a spectrum, and then there's sort of a 4th one that's off to the side, and John Miller will cover that for us. So the first one is what we call direct debt. And direct debt, this is probably the most familiar to all of you, is where GPA would just go out and issue bonds directly, and that's diagrammed in the upper left corner. And then over time, GPA receives revenues from its customers and pays debt service to investors. And here's a distinction that I'll make that will become important as we go through the other scenarios, is that the debt service made to investors is paid after its O&M expenses. So this is effectively subordinate to O&M. First dollar comes in, first pays for O&M, and then what's left over pays for debt service, and that's where the coverage that Hiran was talking about comes into play. So this is probably the most standard general financing structure in the municipal market. Everybody understands it, and it's pretty generic, I guess you would say. If we go to the next page, we're going to sort of describe how this manifests itself into cash flow. And one thing I want to mention as we talk about debt service coverage is that we're talking about how much revenues we would have to raise for a given financing structure in isolation. So earlier on slide, I believe it was 4, Hiran showed you the debt service structure, and the debt service declines over time. It's this way. Declines over time, so there is room in GPA's existing debt profile to layer in new debt service, and then perhaps most importantly, the whole reason we're entering into this type of arrangement is because we anticipate that we'll get operating savings over time, that once we factor in the new debt service on the new facilities, but the lower O&M and lower fuel costs will wind up saving money. So that's not factored into what we're talking about here. So if you look at these dark red bars, these are the forecasted debt service coverage ratios as of 2016, and that was 2 years ago. Part of the consulting engineers report determined that Guam power would be at around a 2.36. Now, first column, Sean, and I'm not going to go into this in excruciating detail, but for a $60 million debt service structure, which is what Hiran mentioned earlier for this structure, if you only levied for $60 million for debt, that would dilute your coverage down to about 1.46 per year indenture and about 1.21 on the rating agency perspective. If you raised it at these other factors, then you would wind up having more cash flow. Next page, please. Structure 2 is, we call what you may have heard this term, SPE, which means special purpose entity. Under this scenario, the SPE would enter in, would issue the debt, and then would the debt service would be paid by GPA to the SPE, and that would be used to pay bondholders. And the difference between this and the others, there's two differences. The most important difference, I should say, is that this is paid as an O&M expense of the Guam Power Authority. So this appears in the flow of funds is paid before GPA's own bondholders. So that has ramifications in terms of whether or not you need to make coverage. You don't, technically. And the cost of capital for this financing, even though it's superior in lien to GPA's own debt, is effectively going to be the same as if GPA had issued its own debt. There's a lot of precedence for this, particularly for generating facilities. I'm from Seattle, and in the Pacific Northwest, you see variations of this all the time. The SPE could be a completely separate entity, or it could be something that the GPA sponsored. It's really up to you, and that there's policy considerations around it. But the key distinction being that if this is an SPE that is sold on a what we call take or pay basis, meaning that it's an unconditional obligation of GPA to pay the debt service on the bonds whether or not the project is working, then which is incidentally the same obligation GPA would have in the first scenario, then it's going to have the same cost of capital. Next slide, please. So going to the next slide, we, again, using the same debt service numbers, we don't actually have to raise debt as much. However, raising it would have a different impact on the actual debt service coverage calculations. We can go into that later if you want. Next slide. The third structure is essentially the same as the second structure in that there's an SPE that owns it. The key difference here is that the SPE, the obligation of GPA to pay is not an unconditional, it's a conditional obligation. In other words, it's a take and pay obligation. And that key difference, the fact that there is risk of delivery of power, shifts the credit dynamic quite a bit. And this right here, this kind of this structure is a variation of this structure is what GPA would do, for example, for its solar and wind projects. But in this assumption, in this scenario, we've assumed that GPA would not only, in addition to not only paying the debt service, would pay coverage to the SPE. In this case, we've assumed 1.5 times. Now, the coverage itself, I should mention, this applies to all scenarios, is not necessarily a bad thing. Raising this extra cash, once it goes through the waterfall and you have this coverage that looks impressive to bondholders and assures everybody that you can get paid, well, what is left over can be used for capital expenditures so that you don't have to bond for more in the future. You use that coverage to pay for capital. So merely having high coverage or paying coverage along the way is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just where you want to get your capital funding. So if we go to structure slide, the next slide, there we go, perfect. Again, the amount that you have to raise to pay is higher, but there are less ramifications in terms of the balance sheet. And next slide, I will turn it over. I'll let John Miller cover the last structure.
GPA has outlined today a new program, a new approach to generation. It's anchored by major investment in assets and significant substitution in fuel. Perhaps a change in business strategy could be accompanied by a change in the way that you've traditionally financed your assets. So in the search for lower costs, we're going to present a fourth option for your consideration. This one is more complex than the three that Sean was just talking about. It is used less often, but somewhat more frequently of late. But importantly, and I think this is one of the key points to this, is that it would require the cooperation of nearly everyone in this room, including the legislature, the PUC, and GPA, because it's a different approach in many ways to rate setting, to how you collect revenue, the nature of the credit, and trying to create a more secure stream of revenue for the lenders by creating a different framework on how you go about financing. The way this has worked is that the legislature would start by drafting and approving what's known as a financing order. It's the basis for this type of financing, and under it, among other things, would be authorized the levy of a direct customer charge, which would be put on the bills. It would be levied by GPA, but it would importantly be irrevocable, meaning that you couldn't take it off, non-bypassable, meaning that you couldn't get out of paying it, and it attaches really to the meter in a sense, so that as long as you ever take electricity, you're obligated to pay this charge. Under this structure, GPA would then receive as the billing agent the revenue, but would sell the right to receive this stream of revenue to a special purpose entity who would then issue debt secured by those revenues. Importantly, this structure of a true sale of the revenues, which are a property right under the way that it would be set up in the financing order, creates a bankruptcy remote legal entity and bonds that would be secured by this customer charge independent of GPA. Importantly, in terms of how this works and creates the credit quality, is that there is an automatic true-up provision such that on an annual basis, or more often if it's really required, there is a change in the rate such that it is always sufficient to pay the debt service on the bonds. That's important for this group because it changes the parties that are subject to, are really a part of the approval process, because there's no subsequent ability of either the legislature, GPA, or the PUC to adjust the rates other than to make them adequate to make debt service whole. Now, the purpose of this is very, very simple. It's to create the highest credit quality, best, strongest pledge of revenues so that you can thereby reduce your cost of borrowing by lowering the risk of repayment for the lenders. It's external to GPA, and it's an option that we fully recognize is somewhat different than the other three, largely in the sense that you can't do it yourself. You really have to put together this whole new structure. But it is, we think, something worth considering given the cost and the scope of this program in an attempt to really just reduce the cost as much as possible. Next page, please. Now, when you go through and you look at these different options, there is a tendency to be simplistic about it and just go to the line that says all-in TIC, which is it's really a statement of what the effective interest rate on the bond is, and you just read across to the to the right where you have the lowest cost, and that's the option that I was just describing. But it's important to step back and say, as Hiran did earlier, that it's not about any one single factor. It's not necessarily the lowest cost, because there are choices here and a balance that you have to find between the operational risks, the way that this sort of sets up the program, the approval process that are necessary, and some of the other structural features, of the loan. As Sean was saying, option one, which is the direct debt, is clearly the most traditional. It is the financing that's sort of tried and true here, and is the way that GPA has, generally gone about this in the past. It clearly works. The unconditional obligation, which is option two, is again roughly the same cost as direct debt, but it has the benefit of being done through a third party, so it can be set up through a power purchase agreement where the obligation is treated as an operating expense and quite directly compares to the fuel costs that you're paying today. And the chart that was shown earlier, where we were showing the aggregate amount of fuel that is the expense that GPA is incurring today for oil, in many ways that becomes the target, if you will, where you're trying to fit the new debt service, the new cost of LNG into that box and leave some savings as a result of that. And this most directly creates an expense that can be booked as an operating expense and looks very much like the fuel costs that you're paying today. So on a budgetary and sort of rate-making basis in terms of passing through on the fuel adjustment clause mechanism, that's an approach that works, really fairly well. On the next page, we just talk for a minute about some of the things to consider. Obviously, this is a program that's under construction at the time being. There's a good deal of discussion about the elements. Obviously, the ability and the desire to have a special purpose entity, be the issuer of the debt. There's been a fair number of references today about the ownership of the assets, whether or not there would be, a third-party owner-operator, whether or not there would be a separate management company, whether or not ownership is important for you directly. There are other concerns in terms about management and operations. And as Hiran was mentioning, there are different rating agency concerns depending upon whether the obligation backing the debt is a direct, unconditional, unconditional, or based on one of these sort of surcharges. There are complex interactions on the rate covenant, and some of those other charts we're showing, and particularly on option 4, the oversight and rate-making framework is important because that's a significant change from what is in place today. Moving on to the next page, there are a lot of sort of technical details that are important to really balance your business objectives with the structure of the financing. It doesn't necessarily have to be the case that all of the components are the same. There's different elements of the capital program that could be financed on different ways. The financial strategy needs to be highly correlated with your rate-making strategy. There was a reference earlier to capitalized interest being evil. It's not evil. It's just the way that you can time when the rate increases, or if you will, the cost of the debt service hits the rate structure. And so it's an ability to say during construction when you're not getting the financial benefits of the new generation, you shouldn't pay for it. That timing, if you will, on the construction really is part of the capital cost. And when you get the benefit of the change in asset and the change in fuel procurement strategy, that's when you should start paying for it. So it's strictly a timing mechanism and something that could be a very important part of the larger rate-making strategy. Obviously, the debt structure is also part of that longer-term kind of cost allocation. These could be maturities of a very long life of 30 years or more. That is both a way to manage the aggregate level of debt service by keeping it low. It's also a way of taking the benefits of very long life financial assets and more appropriately matching it with the beneficiaries who will have the use of those assets for a very long period of time. The assumptions that you saw earlier were based around 100% fixed rate bonds. There are many instruments and other ways that you could do that, including both variable and subordinated debt. And lastly, one of the important parts of this whole program is to match the use of the facility with the financing structure. And although generally it has been the case here that all the power is sold to your customers, potentially there would be private parties that may want to take that in a different arrangement, so the private use issues, are something that I don't think are an issue, but obviously important in terms of the final nature of this plan. I think we'd just like to end at this point, and I just talk a bit about, I think, the message that we'd like to leave with everybody, and that's that these facilities can clearly be financed. The business strategy that has been outlined by all of the GPA speakers is something that can be done. And I've always found this, I've always kind of admired this plan because it's not just taking on new debt for kind of a new strategy. It's replacing existing costs that you pay for in fuel with a less expensive alternative for delivering energy. Now, we think that some of that's debt service, some of it's gas, but the aggregate is this is a substitution of a lower cost for a higher cost, and so this is an integrated plan that brings financing to really a business strategy of lowering rates over time, not just adding additional debt service. Now, the options you have are many. I think that the three most likely ones here is the direct debt. There's some off-balance sheet options here that I think all of us believe have some real advantages to you. There's this, rather more exotic one of using a dedicated revenue stream to lower costs even more, if that becomes important as part of the aggregate cost strategy. But nevertheless, at the end of this, as we put together this strategy, you have to remember that we understand what your goals are in the IRP, and the financing has to reflect and really help deliver the same goals. And it's low cost, it's to respect and enhance your credit quality, through the execution of a plan that really matches your business goals and keeps the costs low within kind of an acceptable rating agency framework, that it respects the regulatory framework that you choose to use for this program, whether it's the existing one or a new one, and that it puts together a place an acceptable financing with manageable and understandable risks that you would take in the search for the low cost, and that at the end of the day, it can be characterized in the right way as your balance sheet, so that this important correlation between the existing fuel cost and the new aggregate expenses, can show the overall, savings. So it's our job, both the Barclays and the Citi's team, to sort of help you think through the options and the choices, implement what is a very exciting and I think effective program that you've advanced today.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. So, do we have questions for the panel? Simon?
So I cheated and looked at it over the weekend. It seemed to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there's four unique options. I'm okay with SPEs, but I noticed that the two that seem to be the more difficult ones, there was a slide, maybe one or two slides up, you had the four models up there. Maybe someone can reverse.
April will get that for us.
Okay. Yeah. It looked like the cheapest was still direct, if I'm reading this right. That's why I just want to make sure I'm looking at this right. I'm looking at, here's the four different ways: SPE project finance, SPE unconditional obligation. Every time I hear that word unconditional, it always makes me nervous. Direct debt, the traditional model, and SPE customer surcharge. And I was reading across the debt service lines, and did I read that right, that direct debt appeared to have the lowest debt service, or am I missing something?
Now, the surcharge has the lowest debt service. It has the lowest debt service because you are borrowing at a higher rating, a lower interest rate. So that differential in our scenario is around a $3 million difference.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. So 2, 3, and 4 actually are very close to each other. So if I were to have a takeaway, we would probably be working the most on options 1, 2, and 4, and three because of one of its costs. I think we've learned when we did the IPP financing that, you know, they're not always cheaper than us, and they have their margin in it. So now that we're at least better in the marketplace, I'm thinking conventional financing at least can play a role. The SPE is sort of a variation on how to take advantage of both our access to the markets and yet playing around with the balance sheet. So the takeaway would be 1, 2, and 4 seem to be, would that be the right takeaway, that 1, 2, and 4, some variation of those, direct debt, SPE unconditional obligation, and SPE customer surcharge, that those may be the area that we'll spend most of our time in evaluating?
You are correct. And the reason you're correct is that in all three cases, GPA and its customers, or just its customers, have directly stepped up to guarantee the debt. The other case is you've transferred a good deal of the operational risk to either the lenders, you know, or a third-party owner-operator, and it's meaningfully more expensive because there is operational risk that's been, if you will, shifted away from GPA to another party. 1 and 2, although different structurally, and one comes in as an operating expense, one comes in as debt service, in both cases, you absolutely have to pay. And so that's a GPA obligation, and it's different legally and it's a little bit different structurally, but the obligation to pay is completely your operating risk, and you have guaranteed it in both cases. The number 4 case that I was describing is one where you bypass GPA if you assume that you're the risk, and you put it right directly on your customers without any intermediary, and they pay it eventually to a trustee who pays it directly to the bondholders, and so there's sort of a titanium pipe where the cash flow right straight from the customer's checkbook to the lenders. So it takes out even the intermediate step of having to go through you. So.
I know I have to explain the LEAC twice a year, and believe me, trying to explain to 40,000 customers that now you're writing a check to some guy in New York, I mean, that would be the challenge. But anyway, it's way early to rule anything out. The one thing that I wanted to, the one takeaway that I wanted to emphasize also, and I thank you for picking up on something I think I picked up on quite a while ago. We spend $500 million a year on power here on Guam now. We collect every penny of it. Our collection history is very strong, very good. You're familiar with that. And 350 of that 500 million is oil. 300, 350 plus or minus, yeah? And we've always said it, so we can prove to the lending community and partners, hey, when we bill 500, we collect. Here, the audited financials show that. That's not a problem. So the cash flow is good. We're leveraging the community's cash flow to make this transformation work, with the idea that we can take that 300 to 350 in fuel costs, convert that to fixed costs for combined cycle generation that allows us to burn a new fuel, right? And then pay for the new fuel that we do end up deciding to utilize, with the hope that renewable growth really speeds up so that we need as little capacity as possible from carbon-based fuel source and carbon-based fuel, even if it's LNG, because I think Biliana put it very well. 15 years ago, oil was our friend. Who was thinking about gas? At the solar conference, we all said, well, what's it going to be like in 10 years? And we looked back at what it was like 10 years ago, and none of the predictions came true. So we know that even as a commodity, even using LNG, there's no guarantee that it's always going to be cheaper. So you need to think about it creatively and hedge. But when I think of the Northern Marianas, I also think that they've got some challenges in terms of their operations, but they do have a bucket of money that's being spent on energy every year. And if we can figure out how to leverage that bucket of money, they need some assurances that it's going to get collected and paid. But assuming we can get over that hurdle, that this model can help other smaller communities. I know it's not a direct transfer, but the idea is to leverage oil dollars and convert them to fixed costs, capital investments that can burn something else besides heavy oil, and still have money left to pay for a cheaper type of fuel, or at least one that we believe, given the marketplace, has the best chance of being lower cost over time than heavy oil.
It's worth repeating, I think, one thing that you just said. We've spent all day talking about the physical plan of changing generation. And this presentation we just gave is more about the financing instruments and mechanically how they work. The business case for this as a financial strategy, not a financing strategy, but a financial strategy for GPA is exactly what you just described, is that there is an existing expense for oil that's $350 million a year, which is, a lot of money. And what you have in place of that is a generation strategy that changes 100% variable cost for fuel to a new generating plan that is partly debt service, the amortization of a different set of fixed assets, and a lower cost, fuel source of LNG, the combination of which is lower than the cost of oil. And so you have this existing budget, if you will, that was the chart that Hiran was showing, that how much you're trying to finance generation within, with a different strategy of generation, with a different mix of assets and fuel, which is in the aggregate lower than what you're currently expending, which is the source of the nearly $1 billion of savings over time that you're talking about. So the financing strategy is a mirror image and a complement to the generation strategy, which we believe can be implemented through any of these financing tools, in terms of, the market access.
Okay, great. How about a round of applause for this gentleman?